Hello. Okay, so this is just a very quick review of your biological diversity unit for the PAT. Of course, this is not enough to study for that exam. You will have to go over your notes, go over all your check and reflects, and go over your textbooks to ensure that you study absolutely everything that we've done in the course to ensure your utmost success on that final exam on the PAT. So biodiversity is reflected in the variety of life on Earth, and what I've typed out here for you are some terms that you should definitely know, and of course knowing the vocabulary is essential to doing well, but you'll have to explore these topics a little further. I can only go into so much detail on these videos, but the review we provide in class, as well as all the notes that I give you on Google Classroom, will help you get through that. So Earth and its environments are home to millions of species. Biological diversity refers to the variety of species and ecosystems on Earth. There are three main components to biological diversity. There's that we talked about. There's ecosystem diversity, community diversity, and genetic diversity. Ecosystem diversity has to do with the variety of habitats and the variety that we see in many different ecosystems all over the world. Community diversity just means that in different areas within an ecosystem, you're going to have both biotic and abiotic factors interacting with each other. And when you have more than one population of species in an area, that is considered to be a community. So for example, a park, you have dogs, you'll have cats, you'll have some foxes, you'll have grass, you'll have plants, and this constitutes a community. And the last type of diversity is genetic diversity, and that just has to do with the variations that occur within a species, among the individuals within a species. And a good example of that would be human beings. Okay, if you take a look around the classroom, you'll see diversity. So species, as I said, coexisting in a habitat are interdependent. So this means that there's going to be a relationship between organisms living in an environment. The possible interdependencies are predator-prey relationships, commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. Don't confuse predator-prey relationships with parasitism. In a predator-prey relationship, it's just one animal eats another animal for sustenance. In a commensalistic symbiotic relationship, one organism benefits while the other one is neither harmed nor benefited. In a mutualistic relationship, one organism is benefiting while the other organism also benefits. A good example of that would be pollination of plants by bees, and when they get the nectar from that. And the last one is parasitism, where one benefits and the other one is harmed. A good example of that would be a mosquito bite on humans. Different species share limited resources by having different niches. So again, a niche is the total job description of an organism in an environment. So you can think about it: what eats that organism? What does that organism eat? Where does that organism live? What is the total description of that organism in terms of its functionality in an environment? Okay. There's also something called resource partitioning that you do need to know about, and all that is just if organisms live in an environment where they compete for similar resources, sometimes they could limit that competition if, let's say we have birds living in a tree and they both compete for the same sort of seeds. Well, one species of birds realizes that, well, you know what, we could just fly up to the top of the tree and get access to the same resources, and we'd be fine. Whereas the other species would remain closer to the ground and get that same resource. That's an example of resource partitioning. Natural selection is important as well. It's the selection of desirable traits by the environment. So that's an important thing to understand. A lot of people kind of forget that natural selection is selection that is made by the environment. So the environment will pose some sort of a stress, for example, or some sort of condition that will favor certain individuals of a species that have characteristics that will enable them to survive in that environment. And if they can survive, they can reproduce. If they can reproduce, they will pass on their genes to the next generation, so that the generation will then carry on those characteristics that will enable them to survive further in that environment. That's the whole concept of natural selection. So an example of natural selection would be, we went over bacteria lots, but an example of natural selection occurs with Darwin's finches. And with Darwin's finches, some birds that live in an area that require or have a lot of seeds that are very tough to crack open. Of course, if these birds have small beaks, they cannot crack open the nuts to get to their food. And so what happens over time is that those birds with smaller beaks don't get enough food. They don't get enough food, they don't get enough energy, they cannot reproduce. Their characteristics will not be passed on to the next generation. And then eventually when they die, in the next generation you will no longer see birds with smaller beaks. On the other hand, the birds with the larger beaks, when they are able to crack open, those nuts to get at the food, then they will proliferate, they will gain strength, they will be able to reproduce, and then the next generation will have those characteristics, enabling them to survive in that environment. Okay, so that's section 1, and I'm just kind of looking through the book here to see if there's anything else that I should want to mention for section 1. I think that pretty much does it for section 1. Again, there are biotic and abiotic factors that you know very well. Biotic factors are things that are living in an ecosystem. Abiotic factors are non-living things. Species distribution is actually another very important thing. On page 11 here of your textbook, you will find more diversity of species towards the tropical areas in the equator, around the equator, than you will in the north and southern hemispheres. Again, classifying biological diversity is important. There's a 5-kingdom classification system that has been used. So Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Protista, and Monera have been used in the past, but now there is more the different sort of classification system that's used, and it's the kingdom, the phylum, the subphylum, the class, order, family, genus, and species that are used, and you have to remember that for the PAT for sure. Okay, so that's all of section 1. We talked about symbiosis. All right. Oops. Okay, section 2. As species reproduce, characteristics are passed from parents to offspring. There are 2 kinds of reproduction we talked about in class. We talked about sexual and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is typically what happens with plants and some bacteria. The whole thing about asexual reproduction is that it only involves one parent, and the inheriting happens so that the offspring has identical characteristics. Okay, and that's because the adult makes an exact copy of itself. And so there are different forms of asexual reproduction that we talked about. We talked about binary fission, we talked about budding, and we talked about spore production. In binary fission, a cell is going to split exactly into producing 2 identical individuals. Budding, this happens with the hydra and the yeast. The parent produces a small bud or a smaller version of itself. Eventually it grows an extension of itself and separates it. Spore production happens in plants such as ferns, And spores are similar to seeds, but they're produced by the division of cells of the parent and not the union of two cells. So that's why it's asexual reproduction. And then there's vegetative reproduction. It's the reproduction of a plant that does not involve the formation of a seed. So for example, if you take a cutting from a plant and you put it in water, that cutting will eventually grow. Okay, so sexual reproduction involves two different individuals. Sexual reproduction happens in both plants and animals. In plants, sexual reproduction requires the joining of a male gamete with that of a female gamete. And if you take a look on page 33 of your textbook, you have to know all the parts of the plant. Okay, so in terms of its reproduction. So we have the male reproductive system is towards the periphery of the flower, and that's made up of the filament and the anther. They come together to make the stamen, and that's the male reproductive part. The stigma, the style, the ovary, the ovule, and the receptacle in the middle of the flower make up the pistil, which is the female part of the plant. With sexual reproduction in animals, you have male sperm, which has half the number of chromosomes, combining with half the number of chromosomes from the female egg, forming what's called, the first step is called a zygote, which has a full set of chromosomes, and then the zygote will eventually undergo mitotic divisions, and then the cell division will continue until it becomes an embryo, okay, with 46 chromosomes when it comes to human beings. Asexual and sexual reproduction have advantages and disadvantages. The main disadvantage with asexual reproduction is that there's no variation. So there's no way to protect the species if one characteristic can just wipe out an entire species. But with sexual reproduction, the advantage there is that you do have a lot of variation, so that can ensure the survivability of the species. The advantage of asexual reproduction is it happens quickly. The disadvantage of sexual reproduction is that it takes a long time and takes a lot of energy to produce viable offspring. And just think of human beings. Typically, when babies are born, they're born. Only one baby is born, and it takes 9 months for that baby to come to term. It takes a lot of energy for sexual reproduction. Okay, section 3 now. Section 3 has to do with a very important molecule, and you learned about this also in Unit C, deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the inherited material responsible for variation, and it is the transmitter of the genetic code. So how the genetic information gets from parents to offspring, it's through DNA. Okay, so DNA is organized into chromosomes, okay, and it's like a ball of yarn. Okay, so a ball of yarn, all of that stuff kind of intertwined as the chromosomes, and then the chromosomes can kind of unwind, and they form these little packages, and then you can further unwind that, and you get to see the DNA. Watson and Crick are the two scientists that are credited for finding the structure of DNA. DNA is like a ladder. It's kind of like a ladder. It's a double helix that's kind of intertwined, and certain base pairings happen. So we have our base chemicals, they're called. There's 4 of them. There's guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine. And with the pairings, because they have specific pairings, they form the genetic code, the blueprint to code for protein synthesis in the body. Okay, so that's a very, very quick review of DNA. So a gene is a single uninterrupted segment of DNA which codes for instructions. We can see all the genetic pairs of chromosomes on what's called the karyotype, and a karyotype is just it just shows all the chromosomes. So for example, if you look on page 43 of your textbook, figure 3.6, you'll see a karyotype that shows all the pairs of chromosomes in the human body. Another term you're going to have to know is something called an allele. Allele is a different expression of the same gene. So for example, we use this example in class a lot if we're talking about the black cat and a white cat. The gene that we're talking about is the fur color, but the allele is going to be black and the other allele will be white. So allele is just a different expression of the same gene. Section 3.2 is very important. It talks about mitosis and meiosis, and a lot of you got confused by that during the test. Mitosis is just straight up cell division. You're going to end up with two parent cells that have the exact same number of chromosomes as the original cell. So mitosis happens in asexual reproduction. It also happens in, say, in your body when cells have to get repaired. Meiosis is happening in sexual reproduction. Okay, and there's something that happens just before the first division, because there are two. In meiosis, the cells are going to divide twice. What happens is the chromosomes cross over, and as they cross over, it produces genetic variation. At the end of meiosis, you're going to end up with 4 cells that have half the number of chromosomes. And that's good, because if it's going to happen in the gametes, then you want to ensure that when sperm and egg unite, that they each have 23 chromosomes, for example, with humans, so that they can fuse and have a total of 46 chromosomes. Okay. Patterns of inheritance are also important in section 3. So this is where we discussed Punnett squares, and Punnett squares are just really good tools that we talked about, where we can have, let's say, this would be a homozygous individual, let's say for green eyes, so we have capital G and capital G. And this would be a heterozygous individual, where we have the lowercase g, which represents the allele for, let's say, red eyes. Okay, we're talking cats again. So again, this would be a homozygous individual. It's very difficult to write with this thing. Oh boy. And this is heterozygous. Okay. I'm not going to venture to complete the whole word because it's tough to write with this. So if we assume, let's say if we cross these individuals using a Punnett square, okay, of course my drawing's not going to be very good, but here's our Punnett square. This is very good to, big G is going to cross here, big G, big G, big G, little g, oh boy, big G and little g. Okay, so in this example, when we have a homozygous with a heterozygous cross, we're going to see that they all will express green eyes because the green allele is dominant. However, if we cross, let's say, heterozygous, and we cross it with, let's say, a homozygous recessive individual, then we could see that these two alleles will pair up to produce red eyes. Okay, so just be sure, don't take any shortcuts, read the questions carefully, do your Punnett square to ensure that you get the right answer. Again, there's also something called incomplete dominance. Okay, so we talked about incomplete. I'm not going to write it out, just listen. It says incomplete dominance. With incomplete dominance, it just means that there is a mixing of the recessive and the dominant allele that will be shown in the offspring. So we talked about in class the black cat and the white cat. So for the black allele and the white allele, we would see something like, let's say, a black cat with white stripes in it. Okay. Alright, so now the last section is section 4, and section 4 has to deal with human activity affecting biological diversity. And I can see here that I forgot to put the main points here on this slide, so I'm just going to have to verbally tell you. So extinction, this has to do with the loss of species from the entire planet. Extirpation is the loss of species from an area of the planet. Both cause reduction of biological diversity. Extinctions and extirpations are caused by natural events and by human activity. Artificial selection is human selection and breeding of plants and animals with desirable traits to produce offspring with those traits. Natural selection is selection of desirable traits by the environment. Again, technologies that affect biological diversity include artificial selection, artificial reproductive technologies, genetic engineering. Strategies to maintain biological diversity include restoration of the habitat and reintroduction of species and the use of seed banks and captive breeding programs. Okay, I hope this was helpful. I will be making some more of these videos. They are going to be a little bit longer than usual just because, you know, it's reviewing of the whole unit. Bye.